Hello, Professor Lightby here. Today's narration, today's narrated lecture is going to concern uh, a couple of the more negative sides of the social animal, um, namely prejudice, and then later we'll talk about aggression. But let's start with prejudice. You've heard the term, you know a lot about it already. Uh, what do we know about it in psychology? Well, prejudice is generally defined as a learned, generally negative attitude toward members of a group. Although in some cases, prejudices, we can have positive prejudices. The term comes from prejudge. But generally, when we talk about prejudice, we're talking about generally a negative attitude toward members of a group. And we've also heard the term discrimination. And discrimination basically involves, that's the behavioral side of prejudice, negative behaviors directed at members of a group. So a good way to think about prejudice is to divide it into three components. Okay? There's the cognitive component, the thoughts that are associated with the objects of prejudice. So for example, a stereotype is part of that cognitive component of prejudice. A stereotype is a set of beliefs about the characteristics of people who belong to an identifiable group that's basically overgeneralized to apply to all group members. An overgeneralized set of belief, that we say they're all like that or something to that effect. The affective component has to do with our feelings associated with objects of prejudice, like, dislike, okay? Um, in particular, dislike when we're talking about negative prejudices. And the behavioral, the actions associated with objects of prejudice, that is discrimination, as we saw in the previous slide. So where does prejudice come from? Well, we've already seen in this in the course in introductory psychology um, learning, okay, and the processes by which learning occurs, okay, and we've seen examples of how prejudiced beliefs, okay, and even feelings can be developed or learned through observational learning or through operant conditioning. We can also talk about automatic prejudice, or has become the um, catchword, often misunderstood in the media these days, okay, implicit bias, okay. And what automatic prejudices really involve is learning that's occurred through ubiquitous, pervasive cultural associations that we make that basically permeate our culture, and that we learn them simply by being in that culture. Okay, we learn these sort of conditioned associations. Um, Learning also takes place by our personal experiences in a world where everything is not equal. Some people are treated differently than others, and that's something that we may experience personally or observe among people that we personally know. So learning is a big deal in terms of a source of prejudice. Cognitive processes and mental shortcuts. Okay, so as we can talk about, and we will a little bit later, about things that we've encountered in the past. Availability, um, the availability heuristic, confirmation bias, normal cognitive processes that basically can serve to not only create a stereotype, but also to sustain it. And we'll get back to that in a little bit more detail in a moment. That natural categorization processes, we all categorize. Remember the formation of categories, the development of prototypes that tend to get overgeneralized to, in the case of a stereotype, to every member of a group identified as belonging to that group. So that we'll talk about the natural categorization, those processes of categorization, okay, those thought processes are very natural, and they do lead to stereotypes. We can talk about in-group favoritism, okay? That the in-group, as we'll see in a moment, tends to be viewed more positively than members of groups outside of ours, okay? That we judge the out-group as less diverse than the in-group. Basically, essentially a perceptual and cognitive bias to see members of groups other than ours as more similar to one another, and to be able to see diversity and differences within our own group. Something we'll get to again in just a little bit. And then emotions, okay? And in fact, in-group favoritism could just as readily fall under the emotions category. That's part of it too. But people, as we shall see, become more prejudiced or express their prejudices more readily when they perceive threat to self-esteem, to social identity, to other forms of threats. Okay, frustrations can lead to aggression, and often the examples that we will see later. But displaced aggression happens in prejudiced relationships, such that sometimes the targets of prejudice are more subject to negative kinds of emotions and aggression that, owing to frustrations that were created by others, okay, not by but by others that you can't aggress directly against, so you find a safe target or a scapegoat. That might be a target for your aggression. It might be a group that you have some prejudices against. Remember early on in our course, when I talked about the research from long ago showing that southern the price of cotton in the South over the years was negatively associated with the amount of lynchings that took place. Okay, so that the lower the price of cotton, the more likely, the greater the incidences of lynchings and other aggression against mainly blacks. Back in the earlier part of this century, and I'm sorry, of the 20th century and in the 19th century. So the frustration comes from not being able to do too well economically, and that frustration is displaced but into aggression toward a safe scapegoat target, namely, in this particular case, African Americans. Okay, now I want to remind you that you should make sure you watch the video about prejudice that's at the video theater content area. Okay, it's interesting. There are several psychologists who talk about prejudice. There's good video accompaniment to that. So if we talk about automatic prejudice, okay, automatic prejudice has to do with having formed through cultural associations, through experience, through the media, and so on, some sort of association that becomes so well learned and conditioned that it really becomes implicit, and it happens to us even when we don't want it to, and in this kind of automatic way. So, for example, in this study, okay, there's been many studies like this. People are presented with faces, okay, either white or African American, faces, okay? Um, and also, and then presented very quickly with another object that could be a tool, could be a gun, some cases was a gun, um, but in many cases was a more innocent object such as a tool, okay? Um, so we we get this, let's run through that again, okay? Uh, so you're presented with very quickly, like, almost subliminally with a black, just a brief exposure to a face, either white or black, and then a very brief exposure to a weapon or to an innocent object. Okay, and so the question becomes, and then you're asked, what did you see? Okay, um, and in fact, people are more likely to misperceive having seen a gun when the face was black, okay, than when the preceding face was white, okay, suggesting sort of this conditioned association between weapons, violence, for example, and African American males, okay. So this kind of thing makes it a little bit easier to understand, but not excuse situations. For example, when the police have shot an African American who was basically reaching into his pocket for um, identification uh, or some other thing. Um, Misperceiving, okay, because it's an automatic and a quick response, and because of this unconscious association, and then more readily to perhaps shoot or to arrest or to whatever that individual. There are a number of very well-known examples of this out there. Um, okay, there's a visual mask, and what did you see? It wasn't a gun, but um, more likely to be misperceived, as I talked about. So this gets us into that whole idea of implicit bias. Doesn't have anything to do with any conscious prejudice, okay, but a conditioned association, okay, between certain phenomena, okay, and a person's race or ethnicity. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that many people um, who have some level of prejudice, okay, um, or have little level of explicit prejudice, okay, may nevertheless have implicit prejudice, okay, so that we can get a duality in the same person, okay. So one theory that deals with this is that, so for example, um, uh, white prejudice against African Americans, against blacks, okay. So there are what are known as people who researchers call aversive racists, okay, that they exemplify aversive racism. So at a very conscious level, okay, such individuals perceive that they're very egalitarian. Their self-perception is that they're not prejudiced, okay, but at some unconscious level, okay, there is some aversion toward the minority group, toward blacks in this case, among whites, okay. Um, and though that kind of unconscious aversion, okay, that negative affect, okay, comes to the fore under certain kinds of conditions, such as when one is under some strain, one is reacting in sort of an automatic way. So people don't perceive themselves as prejudiced, but at some unconscious level, they have these associations. Um, there are also this whole idea of self-discrepancy, that even unprejudiced people, of course, have conditioned negative stereotypes that were learned during socialization into our um, culture, okay? And so there's this self discrepancy, And sometimes people act on those negative conditioned stereotypes, okay, even though they don't personally have prejudiced beliefs, okay. And research has shown that within practice, one can learn to become more aware of these conditioned negative stereotypes that we hold and not let ourselves be influenced by them. Okay. Well, let's talk about the cognitive component of prejudice now. Let's talk about stereotypes. Okay. And what we're going to see through a series of slides, okay, is how stereotypes form and survive. Okay. Now, some of it we've already seen. We probably won't revisit that too much, but learning. Okay, we've talked about how learnings can lead to the creation of associations. Okay, um, and from there, stereotypes. Okay, um, we've I've talked a little bit about how we have pervasive exposure to stereotypes in our culture. Okay, um, and our lifestyle may compel us to see relationships that um, don't exist in a broader scale, but our life is structured in such a way that um, we tend to see certain things going with certain other things. Or so, for example, we may, if we're a white individual living out in the suburbs only encounter African Americans in subservient positions, okay, working as janitors or in other lower kinds of uh, low wage jobs requiring less education. We may only see them in that encounter. We may only ever encounter African Americans if we're white suburbanites when we have to drive through the city and we have to drive through, bad neighborhoods, and of course our poor neighborhoods that are populated by African Americans. So we make these associations. We're not putting ourselves in a position to see that this is not, um, you know, the whole story. Okay, so we have these pervasive exposures, and it might be very selective depending on where our lifestyle and our life circumstances and where we live um, uh, allow us to pass through. Okay. Um, then there are normal processes of categorization, which we're going to talk about. We've already seen. And then there are normal cognitive processes uh, that support prejudice and allow it to survive. So let's look at some of these in order, or in some semblance of order, just to give a little bit more examples here. So there's this whole idea of the formation of illusory correlations. Okay, what's an illusory correlation? Well, it's seeing a relationship when in fact no relationship exists. It's illusory. Okay, so here is um, an example of studies that sort of demonstrate how illusory correlations can form when we're observing people. So in this particular example I'm giving, um, what people were asked to do, participants in the study, they were asked to flip through um, a large number of vignettes describing a behavior, okay, of two different kinds of people who, in the story, populate a community. Okay, there are people in group X, that's the majority group, and then there are, see, most of the people you can see um, are group X people, okay, and then there's a minority group, the group Y people, okay. And so this is a completely, sort of an imaginary. People are asked to put themselves in this position. We're going to describe the members of this community. So what you learn is that the individual, if you're the subject, um, is a member of Group X. He's a Group X person. Okay, he's an Xie. Okay, and you learn about a behavior, and the behavior was either positive or negative. Okay, and you learn about some of the minority group, the Y people. Okay, you find out this person's a Y person, and here's the behavior he did. Okay, so as you can see, if they saw 100, if they read 120 vignettes, okay, um, 3/4 of them were positive. Um, For the group X people, 75 of them did positive behaviors, 25 did negative behaviors. And then the group Y people, 15 did positive, 5 did negative. So do the math, that's the same proportion. So there's no correlation, right? Group X people are just as likely, equally likely to do positive behaviors as are group Y people. But after they go through, they learn all about the citizens of this community, the group X and the group Y people. They are then asked to rate those people, okay, and to also estimate how frequently they behaved in a given, either positively or negatively, okay. And what you tend to find is that for the group X people, they're pretty accurate. This is idealized data, but this is the way the differences went. Um, we see that with the group X people, the perception of group X people is pretty accurate. Okay, the majority group. But if you look at the minority group people, memory is a little bit different than reality. Okay, they see group Y people as more likely to engage in negative behaviors. Okay, than they actually were. Okay, and more likely to engage in negative behaviors than their memory of what the group X people, the majority group people, did. Okay, so they recalled more undesirable subjects recalled more undesirable behavior among group Y people. They also, when they were asked to give their feelings, their affect, their favorability, they showed lower ratings of liking of the minority group relative to the majority group. Okay, um, despite the fact that they behave the same way. And how is this explained? Well, things that we've already seen in our earlier discussions of social psychology. What you get here is a convergence of salience and distinctiveness. Okay, distinctiveness associated with what's going to be available. Okay, in memory. So, for one thing, if you belong to a smaller group, okay, relative to a large group, and you're kind of the minority group surrounded by a majority group, okay, your behavior is going to stand out more. It's going to be distinctive, okay. Um, it's going to be more memorable because you stand out. You're more the figure than you are the ground if you're in the minority in this kind of scenario, okay. Also, negative behaviors tend to stand out. Negative behaviors are more salient, they grab more attention, they tend to be more readily remembered. So if you're distinctive and you behave negatively, those kinds of behaviors are especially likely to be remembered, okay? To be there as we form impressions, okay? And so, owing to this convergence of salience and distinctiveness, those rare negative behaviors for group Y people, the minority group, tend to get more readily remembered, seen as more frequent, and hence we get this illusory correlation that the minority group tends to behave in more negative ways, despite the fact that there's no reality there. So you can see how that kind of this is a simulation, but you can see how that can play out in the real world. That's how one way in which correlations or stereotypes form. Now, stereotypes have, uh, regardless of how they form, okay, it's it's with the illusory correlation alone, there's not um, there's no truth to the stereotype. But most stereotypes have a small kernel of truth. Okay, that yeah, um, it is more likely that this particular group, to some extent, will behave in this particular way compared to another group, for example. So there might be a kernel of truth, but the problem is it's overgeneralized to apply to all of them. Now, given that, like all categorizations, okay, if we form a categorization, whether or not it has a kernel of truth, we apply it to everyone. Um, Stereotypes allow us to make fast, efficient decisions. Okay, so rather than thinking through and analyzing an individual um, um, and getting all the information, and we have to make a quick decision, we may rely on our stereotype. Okay, um, and they may occasionally serve us well. It's better than completely guessing, and we don't have time to do all this processing. Okay, so stereotypes become heuristic devices to help us process information fast and efficiently. Okay, and we use stereotypes, not surprisingly, then when we're under time pressure and we don't have time to think through the situation or to get more information on the individual, as the case may be, and when we're under high emotional arousal, okay, so that our ability to think in complex, relaxed way is impaired, and so under those circumstances, we may be more likely apply our stereotypes. So, and then now let's look at another. So, this all goes into the formation and the use of stereotypes. And then, how do stereotypes survive? Okay. Well, stereotypes are maintained and strengthened through confirmation biases. Okay. Remember the confirmation bias. Okay. So basically, um, well, we'll get to that. Let's wait on that one. So basically, if you have a stereotype, of sort of a false or at best tiny kernel of truth stereotype about some group of individuals, okay, um, we are more likely to selectively see, okay, and even look for, okay, um, instances that confirm and therefore strengthen um, our those stereotypes in our mind. Okay, so confirmation biases get involved. Remember what happened in the study by Darley and Gross with the little girl Hannah, who comes from the low social economic status, versus when she came from the high social economic status, and then people got a chance to um, um, watch her perform sort of in a middling way on academic tasks. If they thought she was from a low social economic class, okay, low SES, they rated her performance lower because they were honed in on behaviors that confirm their biases. Okay, whereas if they had a positive stereotype of people from high social economic status in educational realms, the same behavior is seen more positively. People are seeing the behavior through um, um, the lens of their stereotype and confirming the biases therein. Um, it's also the case that stereotypes can cause us to act in a way that the stereotype group member really does behave in a stereotype confirming way. Okay, so if you act uh, in a very I don't know, let's take a stiff um, sort of less than friendly manner toward a member of a group for which you have a negative stereotype because you're nervous or whatever the case may be, or you may pull for the very behavior, okay, that you have the stereotype about, okay. That's what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's something that you should probably read more about, self-fulfilling prophecies. We've seen this on the course on a couple of occasions, okay, especially early on. Okay. Then we have the whole in-group, out-group thing, okay. There's a natural tendency, okay, you know, remember the whole idea of belongingness. Well, once we're in a group, okay, um, we tend to favor that group, okay? Even when we end up in the group for very arbitrary, even random reasons, okay? Um, so once we are in a group, that becomes our in group, okay? And we tend to favor our own group, okay, and to misjudge other groups, okay, and quickly characterize them in somewhat simplistic, overgeneralized kinds of ways. The us versus them, in groups versus out groups kind of effect. Go back to the. So this, so a lot of research that you can read more about this, but people tend to see members of in groups of their own group in more differentiated ways. Okay, we're more willing to, so we see them as differentiated, but members of out groups tend to be seen um, um, in, it's called the outgroup homogeneity effect. They're all alike, okay, quote unquote. Okay, that's a very natural thing that happens when we follow this natural tendency to become groupy, if you will, in this way. Um, so is stereotyping inevitable? Okay. Um, well, we've seen that bulleted summary, right? Uh, this is also the case, okay? Just being aware of stereotypes can trigger those illusory correlations. The stereotype could just have been formed by the illusory correlation, and it can be triggered in turn. Self-fulfilling prophecies and other biases, okay? We talked about implicit bias that occurs through cultural conditioning and things that sort of go underground into our unconscious but are easily activated under various conditions. Okay. Well, all of these are true. Okay. Is it inevitable? Well, in some ways, yes, because it's so implicit and so automatic. But what research has shown is that people can actually learn to break the habit. They can practice non-prejudice, okay? Become more reflective, okay? Try to become more aware and hold at bay those automatic tendencies, okay, that we have. And when we do it, fix it, okay? So with practice, people can kind of like, to some extent, decondition themselves, extinguish these kinds of automatic associations that lead to implicit kinds of biases and things like that. Or if we're jumping to conclusions based on a stereotype or a confirmation bias, try to back off it and be conscious of the tendency to do that. So you can, there's hope through learning to um, lessen our inevitable tendency to stereotype and to behave in prejudiced ways. Okay, so we've been talking about the cognitive roots of prejudice, okay, stereotypes and how they form. And we also talked most recently about the so-called other race effect, the we, them, in-group, out-group thing. We can also talk about We also talked a little bit about the availability heuristic. We're going to get that in a second, an example of that. And in the past, we've talked about the just world. Okay, so the belief in a just world, uh, this self-serving bias that people, we get what we deserve when we deserve what we get. Okay, it's a just world. Okay, remember that. um, Belief in a just world. Well, that can be applied at a racial and an ethnic and in a broader prejudice perspective. Okay, so if you um, see that a particular group seems to be perpetually struggling with poverty, with crime, things like that. Okay, what's the tendency? What's one human tendency that there is? Okay, well, it's the belief in a just world. Well, you know what? That must be, they must deserve their fate. Okay, um, because otherwise, how can we explain it and still believe in a just world? Okay, so people must deserve what they get, fed by hindsight biases, fed by cognitive dissonance, as we've seen last in the previous lecture, face-to-face lecture actually, to justify, we need to justify these inconsistencies. Here are these people suffering. Here are these people behaving in an antisocial way. Okay, how could I reconcile that with my need to believe that people get what they deserve, or any kind of belief that that these people are just like me, etc. um, um, and that they're not necessarily responsible for what they did. So you have all these potential inconsistencies going on, okay? Um, and so one way to reduce them is to blame the victim, okay? Perpetuate your stereotype, perpetuate your prejudice, okay? And so that's what we mean by how just world beliefs can sort of get in the way of objectively observing what's going on and learning more about it, and ultimately perpetuating your prejudice and those stereotypes that underlie it. Okay, so judging, just to take one more example. So if we see, and this is kind of tied in with the illusory correlation, right? We see dramatic examples of terrorism, for example, carried out by people who are Muslim. Okay, we may form a false association, an illusory correlation, right? So when in fact, okay, this nice Venn diagrams here. Here's Islam. Here's the population and the domain of terrorism, and here's the overlap. Okay, um, but the stereotype Muslim equals terrorist sticks in some people's mind, even though the vast majority of Muslims don't fit this stereotype. So we end up having, because there are these vivid instances, okay, in which there has been acts of terrorism carried out by Islamic extremists, we form this essentially illusory correlation or false association. Thinking habits reinforcing prejudice. That's what we've been talking about. Okay. The availability heuristic, vivid cases. This is review confirmation biases by way of summary. Hindsight bias. Okay. Cognitive dissonance. And just to take the example of cognitive dissonance and make it more concrete. So if my culture, and this is kind of like a metacognition that a prejudice people may have, if my culture and my family treats minorities this way, and now you're a developing young person, you see your culture, your family treating minorities in a particular way. Can we be wrong? Okay. Well, the tendency is, okay, you know, here's what I see. Okay. Well, let's say here's what my culture. Uh, here's how my family and my culture treats minorities. Okay, maybe not so well. Okay, but they are my culture and my family, which I am positive toward. So am I going to blame my culture and my family for their beliefs, or am I going to conclude that the beliefs are true? Okay, that the beliefs are accurate, that they represent reality, and therefore create and sustain prejudice and negative stereotypes on my part as a way of reducing this dissonance. You know, I'm part of this group. I love this group. My group thinks this way about another group. Um, so do I reject my group? Okay. Or do I adopt or maintain the beliefs that they have? Okay. It's a cognitive dissonance conundrum. And all too often, people resolve the dissonance, reduce the dissonance by buying into what the in group's perceptions seem to be. Okay. Finally, in the case of prejudice, we should talk a little bit about social identity theory. Social identity theory basically is a theory that basically says that people have a tremendous need for self-esteem. Okay, we've seen this, right? Uh, we need to sustain positive self-esteem. It's a healthy thing. Okay, it helps us make it through the world to uh, feel good about ourselves and not feel bad about ourselves. Okay, and so we value our personal identity, and then part of that whole self are our social identities, the groups that we um, uh, identify with, that we belong to. Okay, so with personal identity, okay, we maintain our self-esteem through our personal achievements, through our perceptions of ourselves as positive, often through our own experience, and that maintains our self-esteem. We maintain our self-esteem in terms of our social identities because we value group achievements. Okay, we bask in the glory that our groups achieve, of the successes our groups achieve. Okay, um, and we also tend to show favoritism toward our group. Okay, um, because that's part of our self-esteem. Of course, we're going to be partial toward our groups. Helps our self-esteem, but sometimes we also accomplish that by um, derogating out groups to make ours look better. Okay, and here's where we get into the problems of prejudice. Okay, so so what social identity theory predicts, okay, is that when one's self-esteem is threatened, okay, that heightens the need to feel good about our group, to favor our group. Okay. Now that can be accomplished in two ways, um, but they both tend to involve, or the two ways is to heighten our group's impression, but also to lower the impression of outgroups. Okay. And so there's this tendency to discriminate in favor of in-groups over out-groups, okay? And under certain circumstances, not only do we favor our in-groups, but we also derogate and disfavor and put down in our own heads the out-groups, okay? So expressions of in-group favoritism, um, when there is this threat to self-esteem, the expressions of in-group favoritism enhance one's self-esteem. So let's look at a concrete example. So this is a famous study by Steve Fine and Stephen Spencer, done back in the late 90s, which was the first of many studies that looked at this phenomenon. So this was a study in which college students, okay, were basically um, engaged in a task, supposedly assessing um, special kinds of intellectual abilities, okay, that might have. And some of the participants got positive feedback. Wow, you did really good. You're really good with this and these intellectual kinds of skills. So they're uh, kind of like an intelligence test. So they get this real positive feedback. Okay, and then in the other half, they got negative feedback, basically essentially saying you didn't do so well. Okay, you're kind of like in the lower echelons of you're pretty low on the scale of what most students at this university are at. So they got this negative feedback. Okay, so they got blows to their self-esteem. Their self-esteem was either enhanced, okay, by this positive feedback, or there was this threat, okay, this negative feedback. So after they get the positive or negative feedback about their own uh, intellectual skills, okay, they are given a task where they have to basically evaluate an application for graduate school, okay, um, from a female applicant, okay, and they're asked to give their judgments, their ratings of this particular target person, okay. Now, the um, the target person either was conveyed not explicitly, but it was pretty obvious. It was the same picture, okay, of a relatively attractive woman who had a picture attached to her. But the name was either an Italian name, okay, or a Jewish name, okay. And so when we think of, we can think of anti-Semitism as being obviously a form of prejudice, okay. So the Italian woman was much more consistent with the ethnic American background, an Italian American um, person. Target, much more consistent with what this population, where they were all Gentiles and Americans, and none of them were Jewish. Okay, so you either have an in-group applicant or an out-group applicant. So let's look at how they rated them. So those people who got positive feedback, their self-esteem is sustained. Okay, they rate the in-group um, target, the applicant whose application they were rating, and the out group, okay, the Jewish uh, sounding woman, okay, in terms of name and picture, okay, it was the same picture, but Jews and Italians, not too much difference in terms of that, okay. It was really the name that gave it away. They rate them pretty equally, okay. But look what happens after they got negative feedback. The ratings of the in-group Italian woman, okay, applicant, are much higher, about the same as they were in the positive, but the Jewish out-group target has this, is derogated, okay, much lower rating, significantly lower rating, okay. So what we see, outgroup discrimination, we see expressions of prejudice, okay, in terms of the rating of hire her or not, accept her or not, no. So that's a form of discrimination when self-esteem was threatened and the target was an outgroup member. And then let's look at what happens to self-esteem. So after they do these ratings, okay, they take a self-esteem measure, okay. And what you can see, so these guys already, their self-esteem is in pretty good shape, okay, so they showed just a little bit of increase in self-esteem if they had gotten positive feedback, because it's already high. But look at the situation with those who had received negative feedback. When they had the opportunity to derogate, okay, by giving her low ratings, the Jewish applicant, okay, they end up that serves to boost their self-esteem. They get their self-esteem back, okay, uh, by derogating an outgroup member. Okay, so social identity theory says basically when we feel some threat to our self-esteem, and actually even beyond social identity theory, when we feel most kinds of lots of different kinds of threats, okay, such as to our security, our safety, and so on. One way we reduce the threat and bring our self-esteem or our sense of safety or so in that aspect of the self back into a positive level is to put down, okay, to derogate um, uh, an outgroup, okay, an outgroup member. We obviously see a lot of this in the everyday world. When people are under threat, there's more discrimination, there's more racism, there's more ethnocentrism, there's more bigotry, and so on. So social identity theory is one way to sort of understand that role of threat. Okay. Okay. So that, I believe, summarizes the discussion of prejudice. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this narration and and then continue with the second one when we'll talk about aggression.